Hi all.
Hi Jordan, my name is Malik Shlibak and I'm a Shia Muslim living in the United Kingdom. I've been watching the various Muslim responses online to your message to Muslims, as I'm sure you've been doing also. It seems that most Muslims have been speaking to their audience about you, but I want to speak to you.
I have been informed by many sources and also observed online, not least because of my discussions with a variety of Muslim thinkers, supporters, and critics, that I have developed an audience in the Muslim world.
Yes, in recent times there has been a clear motivation by you to engage with figures from the Muslim community. With your message to Muslims, I really do hope, Jordan Peterson, that your intention at the very least was to put forward a sincere attempt at furthering this dialogue. But I guess time will tell.
Please forgive my presumption, if you would. It is time for those of you in the Muslim world to stop fighting among yourselves, you Shiites and Sunnis.
I have to ask the question, what fighting exactly are you referring to? It is quite a broad instruction. And we are, after all, speaking of close to 2 billion souls scattered across virtually every country on the planet. So excuse my presumption, if you would, but I'm trying to consider the specific cases where these two sects of Islam are actually fighting, so that I can grasp who you are speaking to before I even consider what it is you are saying. Are you speaking to the non-existent fighting among the perhaps plurality of liberal and semi-liberal Muslims, who wouldn't even casually question, let alone fight another Muslim, Christian or Jew about their beliefs? Or are you speaking to so-called Islamic authoritarian governments who claim to represent one of the two major sects of Islam? If so, then perhaps Muslims ought to conflate US foreign policy with your average American citizen, Or are you speaking to the ever-dwindling adherents of Salafi jihadism, a transnational hybrid religious political ideology based on the Sunni sect of Islamism seeking to establish a global caliphate, who, if given the opportunity, will come down on an innocent non-Muslim and Muslim with his or her authoritarian whip, stone and sword? A group that 99.999 recurring percent of Muslims have, do and will continue to denounce. But since your video is titled so generally as Message to Muslims, you can't be speaking to these three groups. So then who on heaven's earth are you speaking to?
So, how about we all quit squabbling over trinkets and details and face the real problem?
Oh, I see. I think I may have figured out who you're speaking to after all, Jordan Peterson. You're speaking to the significantly large group of practicing, non-violent, orthodox-seeking Muslims who have refused to bow down to the West's liberalization project, aren't you? Dare I say, the Muslims who actually care about their religion, care enough about it, perhaps, to fight about theology. Fight, debate, discuss, argue, or squabble. Use whatever term you see fit. At the end of the day, you're calling for them to stop, which is quite strange, because you've been involved in an awful lot of squabbling yourself lately, haven't you? Which I had understood was for the betterment of society.
And I should also point out that it is not the individual carriers of the woke, politically correct, degenerate, neo-Marxist ideas that should be regarded as the enemy either.
Okay then, so why are you fighting them? These degenerate neo-Marxists that are plaguing the West. Is it because you refuse to stand down? And because you believe and know that they are possessed by a deviant ideology that will sink them and society as a whole into the abyss? An ideology that you know has deviated away from a more proper and prosperous path.
Second, we must understand that even those quite possessed by the spirit of Cain that attracts and drives confused and lost people to the Luciferian ideologies of the materialist utopians are, in the ideal, fully redeemable and only partially consumed.
And yet, you still engage in a fight. I've been watching you do it, Jordan, and I've been cheering you on. You've been attempting to tear down this ideology in order to detangle mankind from its tentacles, haven't you? Including those who have foolishly and very naively placed all of their hopes, dreams, and desires into this deviant ideology, to the point where their entire identity is that. And in your fight against this monstrous ideology, if need be, you, Jordan Peterson, will even shake up a few of these partially consumed poor souls, who you say are fully redeemable.
Even the committed student ideologues who have, for example, attacked me and others like me rather viciously are generally, say, 90%, or perhaps 80%, reasonable and potentially civilized people who could still see the light.
The Abrahamic faith expects from us to act as the prophets did, which is to non-violently fight against all forms of deviation, including warped versions that masquerade as the unified original Abrahamic faith, all while not hating the common folk who are upon deviation. Because just like your committed student ideologues, these common folk are generally, say, 80%, or perhaps 90%, reasonable people who can still see the light. Sounds like the same bloody thing you're doing, doesn't it, Dr. Peterson? Because it is the same bloody thing you're doing, so why should it be any different for Muslims? Is it because Islam and Muslims are inferior? Because what they have to offer is so frivolous and meaningless? Just a group of barbarians who are engaged in surface-level squabbling over trinkets and details. Is that it? God forbid you have such a primitive worldview to cause you to treat Islam and Muslims in such a demeaning way. But it is fair to point out, at least, that as men living in the West, that is something that's been rammed down our throats, especially since 9/11. So if you do have tendencies leaning towards a superiority complex over Muslims, it wouldn't be entirely your fault. But as a man of such experience and education, especially in the realm of psychology, you would be blameworthy if you did not quickly overcome such primitive programming.
Is there someone in the Muslim world willing to build an electronic system to bring people from the Sunni and Shiite community together? A place where people of goodwill could reach electronically across the divide, person to person, and to formulate the kinds of personal, trusting friendships upon which a lasting peace truly might be founded?
There have been plenty such attempts to reach across the divide, but it has fallen flat on its face every time, because every time has been an attempt to bleach away the important theological and historical differences and stuff them away in a dark, dingy corner of a dark, dingy cupboard. While we should build bridges, taking this single-minded and short-sighted approach by itself will only lead to two potential negative outcomes. The first is that it will bring about the exact opposite of what it is trying to achieve. It will drastically increase frustrations among the large groups of religious communities. Instead of encouraging them to amicably argue about what they need to argue about, you take away their voice and demand for them to submerge what they need to express. And this growing frustration among traditional practicing Muslims will only grant the minority violent Salafi jihadists more holes to maneuver through and more leeway for their underground radicalization effort. And then there's the second and infinitely worse potential outcome. If you did manage to succeed in getting Muslims to hold hands and forget all about their theological differences, you would in fact bring about the death of theology itself for good. And in turn, you will witness the death of all that is traditional, divine, and sacred. The very thing you are currently trying to prevent in the West, is it not, Jordan? You wish to play rough in the world of politics. while you admonish religious folk for doing the same thing with theology, while in fact, these supposed squabbling fools are the last line of defense that you, Dr. Peterson, are leaning on.
And you are all threatened, in a very real sense, by the system of vengeful Luciferian ideas that currently confronts all that is transcendent, traditional, and valuable on the sexual front, on the familial front, on the conceptual front, on the psychological and sociological front, and, in the final analysis, on the theological front.
There we go, Jordan Peterson. The threat on the theological front. The final analysis. A fight that must take place for the sake of the survival of theology and tradition in the broadest sense. This is a staple of all Abrahamic faiths, traditionally speaking. Someone as well read into Judeo-Christian literature as you are should know this. Muslims are engaged in a tug of war because they are fighting over what every community after every prophet fought over, which was gradual deviation away from upright theology. It's just that Islam is now the last line of defense, as the previous nations, including the Jews and Christians, have failed. And even though you may not take the teachings of the prophets as literal, but rather as some type of symbolic means for human beings to make sense of their existence, Orthodox Muslims, Christians, and Jews do take it as literal, and it is literal. But even if it wasn't, you, Jordan Peterson, should have enough foresight to know that we should still treat it as literal. Otherwise, tradition, which you believe is fundamental for keeping our social sanity intact, will not survive. The actual threat we face is the death of literal belief in theology. The moment you find that there are none on the face of this earth willing to fight for or about theology, know that you live in a world where either God's upright and untampered theology has become dominant and reigns supreme because those fighting for it emerged victorious, or you live in a world where theology in its deepest meaning has vanished and been abolished and banished by Satan's puppetry and man's own carnal soul. So what fight in the Muslim world are you speaking of that should stop? The fight for theology? The only fight that bloody matters as far as I'm concerned?
Muslims, reach across the sectarian divide. Shiites, find a Sunni pen pal. Communicate with someone on the other side. Sunnis, do the same. And then, maybe, reach out, tentatively, to a Christian, or even, heaven forbid, a Jew.
You want to characterize this theological fight as a childlike playground scuffle that will be solved by finding a pen pal. No one is denying that this fight has brought out the worst in some people, because that's what the truth does, because the truth is potent, and that's what any potent thing does. It attracts the most egregious people, as they perhaps through their cunning nature intuitively know that they can maximally abuse it. And that's why there's a fight. Those who have tapped into the divine truth will never stand down, because they understand that if we're going to give the word justice any value at all, you cannot sidestep justice in practice, and not least when it comes to God. The God that every quark, lepton, and prion in your body depends upon and owes its existence to.
So your best bet on the spiritual warfare front is to make of yourself and your Muslim practice something so admirable that the light shining from your well-constituted psyches and productive, generous, and wise actions is so intense that people convert to your faith from sheer admiration. There's a goal.
Finally, something in your message to Muslims of which I couldn't agree more. But still, no matter how much progress remains to be made towards being exemplar ambassadors of God's religion, this fighting itself does prove something. It proves that the divine message still lives. Theology still lives. Yes, the Muslim world may be at an all-time low and comparatively is limping and dragging its sorry self across the floor. But at least it's moving. At least it's alive. Unlike the long dead and godless world of the West. When will you stop pretending that the spirit of Christianity isn't long dead and beyond the point of revival? You yourself so often repeat Nietzsche's famous words that God is dead off the back of the so-called Enlightenment. So what are you trying to do exactly? Revive a rotten corpse in hopes that you can romance with it once more like old times? Do your best. Die trying for all I care. You'll only be swallowed up by the graveyard that is Western civilization. The Western world has abandoned God so hard that it is now tunnel-visioned and trapped in self-perpetuating, ever-increasing, exponential decay into sin, immorality, sexual deviancy, depression, suicide, materialism, and literal cultural lunacy. And do you know how you can tell this is all in direct, intentional disobedience to God? Because this sinking ship and all those aboard it will never admit why it is sinking, which doesn't take a genius to figure out that it is sinking because they arrogantly abandon God and have taken man's carnal soul in his place. And how would they ever admit it? The entire master plan and claim for fame was that we will prosper if we abandon God. That is what the modern-day Western world is based upon, not Christianity, Dr. Peterson. They say if you wish to understand how far arrogance can go, look no further than Satan himself, a creature not too dissimilar to the human being, and who knows well and good who God is, just like we do, yet still abandoned God due to his arrogance. And every step on his way to hell, knowing of his impending doom, refuses to admit that he was wrong, even with the doors of repentance wide open to this very day. Sounds very similar to where the West finds itself now, don't you think? The ship of the West will go down under, kicking and screaming, before ever raising its hands, admitting it was wrong about God. All aboard the sinking ship of the West. Perhaps if we ignore it, that will do the trick. Perhaps if we convince women that to really be free, you must proudly flaunt yourself sexually for all to see, and push our women to become strong, independent, busy workers, and curse their own wombs that are nothing more than a burdensome weight, slowing them down as they climb Satan's corporate ladder. Why not have no sexual boundaries? Because having sexual boundaries is what God said. We know better than God, and so we must do the exact opposite of what God said. Well, look at that. The values of motherhood and the nuclear family have gone down the drain. And who would have known? Our children have suddenly become sexual deviants. So much so that they forget who they are and find no other way to calm their insanity other than to run to a crooked surgeon to chop off their genitalia. But who cares? Just have a drink. You know, that thing that claims 300 million lives every single year, and with 100 million who suffer from alcohol use disorder. Yes, have a drink. Perhaps if we party harder and take off more of our clothes, then we can forget all about it. While we pretend that what a human being sees and hears has no effect on their psychology and well-being, the doors are wide open. Adverts with hypersexualized women, the latest and greatest micro upgrade to your phone that you don't need at all, but really, really need. And look at how much happier you'd be with this Big Mac in your mouth. Aren't you a good little consumer? Let's push this round the clock. On the TV, on the internet, on public transport, on the highways, on our planes, on our trains, on our high streets, literally everywhere. If we make it so that they need not turn their heads 90 degrees without seeing an advert, we can turn them into literal consumer enzymes. That will surely distract them from their depression and creeping suicidal thoughts, especially if we also inject a continuous flow of entertainment and pornography right into their veins. And we can't forget about the music now. We'll just lay back and listen to our soothing enlightened Beethoven, while children have unrestricted crime, drugs, and literal sex funneled directly into their underdeveloped cerebral cortex. And goodness me, wouldn't it be great if the children literally worshipped these celebrities? So when they put that little earbud into their little ear canal, it'll almost be a religious moment, a replacement for the good old dead church. All while morbidly obese from the excessive intake of nutrition of non-nutritional fast food, neutralized by the caring and gentle, self-regulated, for-profit pharmaceutical industry. Fast food that they can't stop eating, as almost like some sick and twisted Nazi indoctrination program. I'm continuously being told how much I'm loving it. Too depressed to lose weight? Don't worry about it. Just swallow up some of these lovely pills produced by the pharmaceutical industry, the most trusted industry in the world. An industry that's not sustained by the very same satanical, greedy, corrupt, and manipulating economy. No. Nothing to worry about here. Shh. Take this sleeping pill. You'll be all right. We wouldn't dare abuse you when it comes to your health, the thing you care most about. And do you know what will deliver us from all this misery? Our desperate technological innovation that consciously prioritizes profit over our mental health. Like freaks, we turn the population into literal products as we seamlessly survey and monitor every single preference and click in order to feed their desires right back into them. Come on now. We have an economy to build. We have minds to enlighten. Full steam ahead. Let's install a mass surveillance program over the entire population, prying into every detail of their lives. Then finish it all off by installing chips directly into our brains and uploading our very consciousness to become the literal Borg hive mind. That sounds like a great idea. We'll just program the depression out of you. Then God will definitely be wrong. If we use human beings' worst traits against them, we can turn them into a collective supercharged battery to build an economy so grand like none before, and then laugh about how unenlightened those religious folk are. Through this abuse, we'll generate incalculable wealth for the select few, while the rest just about get by. And then we'll justify it by saying you should be grateful that our immense greed is gradually lifting you peasants out of extreme poverty. Don't mind that our supercharged economy has left you all as mere shells of the human beings you once were. But do remember that there's an impending recession on its way, so you behave now. And with all this, let us sit upon our enlightened moral high horse, while we half the time half acknowledge the West's most monstrous war machine the world has ever seen, that has rampaged across all those petty, squabbling, good-for-nothing, dehumanized Muslims, meddling and toppling governments with the mission of indoctrinating, uniting all of us, Muslim and non-Muslim, together as free democratic liberals, all the men, all the women, all the children enlightened together. Brilliant, genius, bravo, encore. Perhaps all of this will prove that we were right and God was wrong, and that our ship isn't really sinking, and so we can point and laugh at all those silly religious Muslim folk sailing away on their little lifeboats with their beards and their bin bags over their heads while they squabble over trinkets and details. We've left the world to run on the carnal soul of man, the most Frankenstein experiment ever conducted on the human race. We've left us to decide, we, who without divine intervention wouldn't know what's good for ourselves even if our lives depended on it. And our lives do depend on it. Sometimes I wonder, is it really possible for the stupidity of man to go this far? Can't you see? Your experiment has failed.
I wish you well as you strive to become the light in the world that your faith truly demands. Let's see if we can unite as people of the book and negotiate our way toward the paradise that we might truly and jointly attain.
How about this for the first point of negotiation? We stop trivializing the highly complex struggles of practicing Muslims. Stop treating them like they are inferior and as if they aren't right about the mess the West finds itself in. And most certainly stop pretending the West isn't the largest force of death, corruption, and sin in the world today. If we can start with that, Jordan Peterson, I'm sure Muslims will be a lot more welcoming to engage in an even playing field dialogue. And we can start lifting our sorry selves out of the mess we're in today, together as a human race.
The best place to find Satan, let's say, is within. If you think the true enemy is in someone else's heart, then you haven't thought nearly long enough about the darkness within, and you have therefore fallen prey to the most subtle temptation of the ancient demonic spirit.
There is no doubt that Satan and his allies from mankind whisper in the breasts of man. But it is also man's own carnal soul that one should take seriously, because that is even more subtle and much easier to fall prey to. As stated in the Holy Quran, Satan will say to the human being, "I promised you, but I betrayed you. But I had no authority over you except that I invited you, and you responded to me. So do not blame me, but blame yourselves." So let us not underestimate our current level of corruption and the severity of the times we live in. It is a very real claim to state that this era is the tipping point of tradition versus modernity. Our actions in this era and this century will determine the outcome of this age-old war against Satan and our own carnal soul, more than any previous generation perhaps. And if we fail, God only knows what kind of evolved, monstrous machine will take the place of the West.
Because perhaps it is time for those who purport to be followers of God to act like it, and to be convincing in those actions, even to those whose premature cynicism and skepticism have driven them into the towers of Babel, constructed by the avatars of the resentful intellect.
Then show us how it's done. Show us what a real follower of God looks like. Come on, I'm serious. Show us. What are you waiting for? What is your purpose in this life, Dr. Jordan Peterson? Because I can't get out of my mind the way you reply to the question of, do you believe in God?
There's something wrong that I can't put my finger on triumphantly declaiming my belief in one manner or another. And so it's something that I prefer to leave in the manner that I've left it. So I act as if God exists. I try to do my best as a person who's obsessed with religious matters.
You don't need to act as if God exists, Jordan. You know that he does. Otherwise, why would you act as if he did? And what acting would you even be able to do if he didn't? You find yourself surrounded by an empire filled to the brim with people who are okay with living in delusion, while you, Jordan Peterson, are not. I know this about you. I have seen enough of your work. You have been spending the better part of the last year trying to persuade your Western counterparts that there is more to this world than they are pretending. Sam Harris and Stephen Fry, just to name a few. Except, you've been saying half of what you know you ought to say and half of what you wish you could. You're after freedom, Jordan Peterson, aren't you? So why don't you claim your freedom? Why don't you follow your own rules that you've outlined in your books, 12 Rules for Life and Beyond Order? Why don't you stand up straight with your shoulders back? Pursue what is meaningful and tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Why don't you tell the truth, the complete truth, about God? He is your God after all. You know that he is. You know it well. You may not know the details yet, but you know enough to know that he is he. So face your dragon, Jordan Peterson. Be a monster. And don't let men play you around now. I'm sure your loving and quite religious wife, Tammy Peterson, would want you to do the same. And,
not least because you have the enemy located in the wrong place.
as it should be evident by now, the radical neo-Marxist ideology is not your prime enemy, but it's done a bloody good job misdirecting you. Jordan, to kill the snake, cut off its head, and stop playing with its tail. You're fighting a symptom of a deeper illness. The smoke you see rising up off the horizon is from a more gruesome and satanic battle that you can't yet see through your current lens. As much as I squabble with other religious groups, and as much as we disagree, I know at the end of the day, we're all taking part in this fight on the horizon. And I know that we all just want to find our way through. This is the great war against God, Dr. Peterson. A war that's been fought by upright men and women since the time of Cain, and carried on the shoulders of all of the prophets of God. But Jordan, I tell you, we could do with a man like you.